What if everything you built, your love, your future, your empire, collapsed in a single moment? Imagine standing at the altar, the world watching, and the man you trusted most never arrives. But sometimes heartbreak is only the beginning. Sometimes the person who shows up isn't the one you expected at all. Tonight's story follows Jamila Ababi, a brilliant black CEO whose life takes a shocking turn in front of cameras, whispers, and headlines. What unfolds is a journey of power, betrayal, loyalty, and a love that refuses to run. But how far can she rise after being dragged so low? And who will stand by her side when the storm refuses to pass? Stay with us until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll always catch our newest stories, and share in the comments where you're listening from. The string quartet kept time as if nothing were wrong, yet the wrongness spread like frost across stained glass, and Jamila Abebe felt it first in her ribs before she saw the empty aisle. Perfume hung thick over pews dressed in white orchids. Cameras waited like predators near the doors. Zuri's hand tightened around her bouquet as a text lit the maid of honor's phone with a single word: delayed. And Jamila scanned the nave for Darren Hale, the groom who had promised constancy and delivered silence, because the silence roared louder than the cello, and the second hand on the chapel clock seemed to scratch at her skin. Her mother's voice slid in low, composed, "Hold, baby," while a publicist she barely tolerated mouthed, "2 minutes." And the officiant cleared his throat, but the doors stayed shut, and in the sliver of breath before panic could take shape, a figure broke the stillness. Not Darren, never Darren, but Marcus Hale in a charcoal suit with rain on the shoulders, and a gaze like tempered steel. And he didn't step into Darren's place. He stepped to Jamila's side, close enough for her to taste the winter air on his lapel, as he lifted her veil and said, almost a prayer and almost a dare, "You don't need to wear his absence like a crown," which struck bone because she had been trained to carry, not to cast off. Flashbulbs cracked as someone whispered, "That's the brother." And Jamila's legs trembled, not from weakness, but from fury contained. And when Marcus offered his arm, she wanted to refuse. Yet the refusal felt like surrender to the spectacle. So she took it and moved, each step a verdict. Down the aisle through the murmurs, past the spray of candles and the soft gasp of guests measuring loyalty against humanity. Through the vestibule that smelled of beeswax and old wood, into a sky that cut blue and cold, where the photographers surged until Marcus raised one hand with a simple, unarguable back. And he didn't touch her again until the door of a black sedan clicked open. She sat with her dress filling the car like a storm cloud. She stared at the ring that no longer meant promise. She tasted metal at the back of her tongue, and when he drove, she finally asked the question that had become a blade. "Where is he?" While Marcus kept his eyes on lakeshore traffic and answered with a truth that left no debris, running, then added nothing, because explanation is sometimes another cruelty. Morning came harsh and fluorescent, and Chicago looked like a city that had seen it all and still asked for proof. So Jamila folded the dress into a garment bag she would not open again, scrubbed mascara into the sink until the water turned gray, slid into a coal suit that fit like armor, and walked into a Bebe Capitol with her chin unbowed, where the lobby marble reflected a woman the tabloids had renamed before dawn. Kiana, her assistant, pivoted from the security desk with a whisper pitched for survival. Trend number 1, #abandoned, and screens along the bullpen bled headlines. Yet the hum of servers and the hiss of the espresso machine steadied her more than any kindness could, because work had always been truth. CFO Martin Lorenz blocked her path with the brittle smile of a man counting reputational risk, saying, "Optics are sensitive," and she replied, "Revenue is stubborn," which pierced his posture enough for him to step aside. The glass walls of her corner office offered the river as a moving diagram of consequence. Her palms pressed the desk's cool edge until sensation returned, and the first sip of coffee tasted like grit and forgiveness. The board chair, Hollis Keene, pinged her with a request for a restorative leave, while PR head Livia typed 3 drafts of non-apologies, and Jamila deleted each draft with the same keystroke. Delete pity, delete apology, Delete the script they had prepared for a softer woman. When a knock came, she didn't look up, assuming another counsel for caution. But Marcus stood there with his jacket unbuttoned and that same rain-creased gaze. And she hated the relief that rose like heat because relief felt like treachery to herself. So she folded her arms and said, "If you're here to explain him, don't." And Marcus shook his head once, answering, "I'm here to see you breathe," which almost undid her, because he wasn't offering rescue. He was offering air. She asked why Darren vanished, and Marcus said, careful as a surgeon, "He mistook your velocity for a threat. He wanted applause more than growth." And the words settled with a cruel correctness that anger could not erase. She wanted to snarl, to throw, to shatter something expensive and useless. Yet she swiveled to the whiteboard instead and wrote 3 words: control the frame, because wrath without strategy had never fed her. By noon, the office felt like a coliseum veiled in glass, partners calling in from Greenwich and Dubai as if distance could smother scandal, while Livia proposed a statement that built a shrine to professionalism and never said heartbreak. And Jamila listened without blinking, then said, "We lead with results," because numbers had always been her sword. Hollis entered on a tide of board protocol and suggested a pause in public-facing duties for stabilization, which was a euphemism for exile, and she answered, "Stability follows leadership, not retreat." Then signed 2 term sheets like signatures were acts of defiance. Zuri slipped into the office, smelling of hairspray and ash, the maid of honor now a crisis whisperer, and she squeezed Jamila's fingers once and murmured, "He didn't earn you," which worked like a stitch closing a tear. Jamila's mother called to say prayer lines had been lit, and cousins were scrubbing the internet one comment at a time, and Jamila wanted to sink into that chorus. Yet the floor under her demanded stamina, not sentiment. When Marcus returned, he didn't bring flowers or apologies. He brought a printout of quarterly projections and a line that cut clean: "Don't fill the empty chair, erase it." And she stared at the outline he slid across her desk. Consolidate treasury, fold Darren's vanity unit into operations, move her name to the top of the masthead, while her pulse steadied into purpose. She asked what he wanted in exchange, and he said, "A company that reflects the woman actually steering it," which sounded suspiciously like respect. And respect, she realized, is the rarest luxury in a room full of money. A text from Darren finally arrived, a single sentence without a spine. "I can't do this," and Jamila felt no collapse, only a recognition that she had dodged a future built on apologies. So she archived the message and thought of her grandmother's proverb, "Walk with the people who run toward storms," and decided storms were where she worked best. When the day turned copper and the river darkened, Jamila called a floor meeting because isolation breeds rumor and visibility breeds order, and she stood in the open area beneath a grid of steel lights while employees watched with the caution of those measuring which way the wind would blow. She spoke without tremor, because tremor would become a headline, and said, "We will not be defined by gossip. We will be measured by execution." Then sketched the expansion timeline across a wall of glass so the plan looked like architecture rather than noise. Questions came sharp and justified: client attrition, reputational drag, sponsor nerves. And she answered with contracts already locked and revenues already posted, while Kiana pushed updated numbers to a live dashboard that climbed like a tide. When the applause rolled, it wasn't loud, it was decisive, and that kind of quiet resolve steadied the building itself. Hollis requested a closed-door debrief and found none of the fear he'd hoped to leverage. Livia asked for a quote and received one that required no varnish. "Power doesn't evaporate because a man left a room." And Zuri mouthed, "There she is," from the back row. After the crowd dispersed, Marcus waited by the elevator bank, not hovering, not claiming, simply present. And he said, "You didn't break," to which she replied, "I recalibrated." And the word fit her mouth like a key. He added one more line, soft enough to be deniable and strong enough to be remembered. "I wouldn't have run." And Jamila let the sentence hang in the charged air between them, because answers given too soon cost something invaluable. The elevator opened and the mirrored doors framed her like a verdict she chose rather than a judgment imposed. And as the city thudded beneath her in restless winter rhythm, she understood the next move would not be survival, but authorship. And authorship would require that she stop treating herself as salvage and start treating herself as origin. She left the mirrored elevator with the word origin burning in her chest, and by the time her heels struck the marble of the 41st floor, she had already decided storms would no longer chase her. She would chase them first. The office smelled of recycled air and tense restraint, monitors humming with unfinished models, staff murmuring in corners as if proximity to her pain could infect them. But Jamila treated their glances like background noise and opened the war room she had carved from a conference space. Glass walls shone with notes scrawled in black marker, timelines stacked like battle maps, arrows connecting mergers and market expansions. The skeleton of a future she refused to surrender. Kiana slid in carrying files heavy with contracts, her eyes sharp yet uncertain, and whispered, "They're circling, clients want reassurance." But Jamila only tightened her grip on the marker and said, "Then we give them proof, not apologies." Martin lingered near the doorway, offering his usual caution disguised as wisdom, speaking of volatility and optics. But she cut him down with numbers that glowed green across her board and sent him retreating. She felt the tremor inside her ribs, not from doubt but from energy compressed too long, and knew she had to expand or suffocate. Marcus appeared again, not summoned, never explained, leaning against the glass wall with sleeves rolled up, his presence steady as gravity, and she wanted to resent it, but found herself breathing easier. He studied the diagrams covering the walls, then said, "You're building something Darren never understood." And she turned sharply, refusing to give him the satisfaction of gratitude. He stepped closer, voice low. "Don't patch his absence, erase it," and slid a folder across the table containing restructuring plans, too precise to be casual. She scanned the details: consolidation of Darren's vanity projects, merger of her division into the core leadership, a blueprint that would make her name impossible to ignore, and her pulse hardened into resolve. She asked why he was helping her, and his answer cut clean. "Because survival isn't enough for you, and because I've watched you long before this spectacle." The words unsettled her more than she admitted, so she shifted focus back to strategy, declaring that if the board wanted fear, she would give them dominance instead. He didn't press, simply remained there like a pillar she hadn't asked for, but couldn't deny. Days blurred into sharpened hours, each meeting a duel with sponsors and investors who spoke in polished threats. In the mahogany boardroom, Hollis Keene demanded she step back from public view, warning of sponsor withdrawals, while Livia polished a draft that begged forgiveness Jamila had never owed. She met their eyes one by one, her voice precise. "Visibility does not weaken leadership, retreat does," and drove her pen through another partnership contract as if signature itself could silence doubt. Zuri visited at dusk, her once sparkling laughter dulled but her loyalty intact, sliding across Jamila's desk a tablet streaming headlines that painted her as ruthless, dangerous, magnetic, and whispered, "They fear what they cannot control," which was meant as comfort, but felt like prophecy. Jamila pressed her palms into the glass wall until her fingerprints smeared across battle plans, her mind echoing her grandmother's voice about storms and endurance, and decided fear would serve her better as a weapon than a burden. She scheduled investor calls herself, each one a battlefield where she refused to blink, while Marcus remained a silent shadow in corridors, intervening only when another director tried to corner her with questions she had already demolished. She hated that she noticed the steadiness in his gaze, hated more that she found herself waiting for it. The night the sky broke into hard rain, she lingered alone in her office with only the glow of the city to keep her company. Contracts spread like shields, coffee gone cold, nerves stretched taut. The storm drummed against the windows, and she felt the press of exhaustion rising. The first crack in armor she had sworn not to show when the door opened without a knock. Marcus entered, rein clinging to his collar, and said nothing at first, just moved to stand by the window, watching lightning split the skyline. She wanted to order him out, but silence bound her more tightly than command, and finally she admitted, "I should feel broken, but I don't." He turned to her, expression unreadable, and answered, "Because you're not glass, you're steel." The words struck deeper than flattery, because they carried no performance, only recognition, and something inside her eased. She walked to the glass, stood beside him, her shoulder almost brushing, and the storm outside mirrored the one she carried within. He murmured, "Most people would hide, but you face the storm." And she whispered back, "I don't know how to hide." Their eyes locked, and in the charged air, the distance collapsed, his hand grazing hers, a touch that felt less like an intrusion than inevitability. She wanted to pull away, but the need for truth outweighed fear, and before she could rationalize it, his mouth found hers. The kiss was fierce, unplanned, carved from tension, stored too long, and for a breath she allowed herself to forget everything but the heat of it. When she broke away, chest heaving, she whispered, "This is a mistake." Yet her body betrayed her with the way her fingers clung to his sleeve. He answered, "Then it's one I'll make again if you let me." And the rawness in his tone left no room for manipulation. She stepped back, forcing space because surrender felt like danger, not from him, but from the world that would weaponize it. Her phone buzzed with a new headline already brewing. A blurred photo of them near the window, captured by a distant lens, captioned, "CEO's secret night with the brother." Fury burned her cheeks as she realized nothing was private, not even her breath. She turned on him, voice hard. "They will use this to destroy me." And he replied, "Then let them try, because what they call scandal is just fear of your strength." She wanted to scream, to demand he leave, yet the thought of facing the storm alone felt heavier than the scandal itself. She shut the blinds with a snap, reclaimed her seat and said, "Tomorrow we double down. No apologies, no retreat." He nodded once, that steady gaze unwavering, and she felt both condemned and liberated. The blinds were shut tight, her vow still echoing in the dim office. And by morning, the vow had become reality because the photograph of their kiss dominated every feed. Headlines screamed betrayal and scandal, investors called emergency meetings, and the glass tower where she ruled felt more like a cage than a fortress. Jamila walked through the lobby with her heels striking too loudly against marble, every whisper slicing through her, but she refused to bow her head. Upstairs, the boardroom pulsed with restrained hostility. Hollis Keene sat at the head like a judge sharpening his gavel. Livia slid press clippings across the polished table. Martin spoke of reputational collapse, and Zuri clenched her jaw at the far end, unwilling to watch her friend bleed. Jamila stood before them, spine iron, and declared that she would not apologize for being human, but she would not falter in leading the company either. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only when Marcus entered, his presence cutting through the air like a blade. And he said evenly, "I stand with her, not behind, not above, but with her." And the room shifted, because certainty had a sound no dissent could erase, yet certainty could not still the storm outside. By afternoon, sponsors threatened withdrawal, media analysts speculated on her downfall, and her phone buzzed with messages that dripped with condescension disguised as advice. Jamila stared at her reflection in the elevator doors, seeing not the abandoned bride they tried to resurrect, but the woman who had already survived humiliation once. And she refused to let shame write her story again. In her office, Marcus placed another file on her desk, a record of financials climbing despite headlines, and told her calmly, "Numbers silence noise." She wanted to believe it, yet rage still burned, because power should not have to defend love. Her mind replayed her grandmother's words about storms, and she realized storms were never conquered in silence. They were conquered in defiance. So she summoned the press to the atrium, lights hot on her face, cameras predatory, and delivered words honed sharp. When someone walks away, you do not collapse. You lead. You keep going. If someone stands beside you when the world watches you burn, you do not call it a scandal. You call it strength. Applause erupted from employees who had gathered, cautious at first but then rising, and the echo was louder than any gossip. But outside that triumph lay ambush. The Hale estate lawyers delivered letters dripping with formal venom, accusing her of conflicts of interest and hinting at removal through a buyout. Jamila read the lines with her hands steady, though her pulse thundered, and she understood the battle had shifted from tabloids to inheritance wars. In the quiet of her office, she confronted Marcus, demanding why his family would go so far, and his answer was stripped of comfort. Because they fear what we are building, because they cannot control you, and because they never intended to share power. The truth stabbed, yet truth also clarified, and she knew retreat would be surrender. Still, when the building emptied and her office hummed with silence, fear slipped in, whispering of collapse and ruin, whispering of a second abandonment that might cost her everything. She clenched the edge of her desk until her fingers ached, repeating to herself that fear could be harnessed, not obeyed. The next morning, she faced the estate's representative across a table in a sterile downtown office with glass walls too clear to hide intention. The man spoke with polite cruelty, suggesting Marcus withdraw from their relationship for a fiscal quarter, promising expedited approval of his inheritance if he complied. Jamila's stomach twisted, but her face remained steel, waiting to hear Marcus's answer. He leaned forward, voice even, and said, "You can keep your approval. I'm not negotiating love." The representative faltered, unable to disguise his frustration, and Jamila exhaled a breath that carried the weight of days of doubt. When they walked out together, the city felt sharper, the wind colder, but her chest lighter because for once she had not been left behind. Still, she knew this defiance had consequences, and enemies would not rest until they drew blood. Back at the tower, the board convened again, circling her like vultures, debating whether she had become a liability, their words soaked with the fear of optics. Hollis pressed for her removal from external roles. Livia warned of irreparable brand damage, and Martin fretted about sponsors. Jamila listened, her expression unreadable, then rose and delivered a presentation that turned their doubts into ashes. Charts flared across screens: growth, expansion, retention, all green, undeniable. She locked eyes with each director and said, "If you want a leader who never makes headlines, find a ghost. If you want profit, follow the one who dares to lead through fire." Silence fell again, this time not hostile but struck, and Marcus cast his vote first, firm and unflinching. "I back her fully, unconditionally." One by one, hands followed until the motion was secured, 7-2, and Jamila stood taller, not because of victory, but because fear had been dragged into the light and exposed as small. When the meeting ended, she closed her office door and let her shoulders sag for the first time, only for Marcus to enter moments later. He told her softly, "You didn't need me in that room." And she answered, "No, but it helped." Her voice stripped of armor. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her back with a warmth that steadied her, and she admitted, "I was ready to walk away if they chose fear." He replied, "But they chose you." And she whispered, "That feels good. It also feels terrifying." He smiled faintly, saying, "That's how you know it's real." She held his gaze, realizing that terror and truth often arrive together, and that both could be born if she refused to run. "That's how you know it's real." His words still clung to her as the boardroom emptied, and by the next dawn she understood that terror could be carried like armor instead of chains. The city outside her window glimmered in pre-dawn hush, towers cutting the sky like promises waiting to be claimed, and Jamila Abebe knew retreat was no longer an option. Survival had transformed into authorship. She stood at the mirror fastening her indigo jacket, her reflection sharper than fear, her hand brushing the scar of humiliation that had once threatened to define her, and whispered to herself, "Origin." By the time she strode into the war room, her team was already waiting. Kiana at the screens, Zuri with files, Martin subdued after defeat, and Marcus leaning near the glass with the quiet of someone who had already chosen his side. She raised her eyes to the charts that mapped expansion across 2 states and declared, "We are not filling a gap. We are building an empire." And her voice carried the weight of inevitability. Contracts signed like drum beats, new clients arriving with wary admiration, the financial press grudgingly shifting tone, and Jamila drove each move with precision because vindication meant nothing without results. Yet the shadow of scandal lingered at the edges. Anonymous columns questioned her focus, investors whispered about distraction, and the estate's legal threats circled like hawks. One evening, when exhaustion pulled her shoulders low, Marcus found her at the rooftop terrace where they had first kissed, the wind pressing against her coat, the skyline sharp as broken glass. He joined her without asking, his hand steady on the ledge beside hers, and said, "You've done more in months than he ever managed in years." She almost smiled, then whispered, "And yet they still measure me against him." Marcus turned, his gaze unwavering, and answered, "Then stop letting them choose the frame. Erase him." His words struck with force, because she realized erasure wasn't cruelty, it was liberation. Weeks passed, and the company stabilized under her direction. The board stopped circling, the numbers demanded silence, and still the press hunted, desperate for spectacle. A grainy photo of her leaving Marcus's loft ignited fresh headlines. Sponsors trembled again, and in the conference hall, cameras waited for her to stumble. Jamila faced them head-on, her steel gray suit absorbing the flash, her voice steady. "My life is not a scandal. It is proof that power can stand even when tested. If loyalty beside me frightens you, then you misunderstand what leadership looks like." The words cut across airwaves, employees erupting in applause, and the image of Marcus standing quietly at her shoulder was broadcast worldwide. The narrative shifted at last, now from abandoned bride to indomitable force, and though some voices still hissed, she felt the ground beneath her hold firm. But rebirth came not only in boardrooms. On a quiet evening, Marcus placed 2 adoption forms on her desk, his tone stripped of persuasion. "We've both been building for the world. Maybe it's time we build for us." Jamila froze, her throat tightening at the thought of family, the fear of vulnerability heavier than any corporate war. She remembered her grandmother's words about lifting others, remembered the ache of betrayal at the altar, and asked, "What if I fail them?" Marcus stepped closer, his hand warm over hers, and said, "You won't, because you don't run." She signed slowly, tears blurring the ink, and for the first time allowed herself to imagine a future not measured in profit margins, but in trust. Months later, the gala hall erupted in light as she ascended the stage in a crimson gown, the applause rising like thunder. She accepted the award for Black Innovator of the Year, her empire standing taller than whispers, Marcus and 2 children watching from the front row. The spotlight seared her, but instead of fear, she felt clarity, her voice carrying through the hall. Strength is not surviving what breaks you. It is choosing not to be defined by it. Legacy is not wealth alone. It is the courage to rebuild when others expect you to collapse. Cameras flashed, the crowd rose, and the children clapped with unfiltered joy. Marcus's gaze met hers, steady and certain, and she knew this was the frame she had claimed at last. Later, when the gala had ended and the streets outside pulsed with midnight energy, Jamila stood with Marcus beneath the city's electric glow. He reached for her hand, not as rescue but as equal, and she allowed herself to breathe deeply, finally free of ghosts. She remembered the veil lifted, the humiliation burned, the board battles, the storm-kissed rooftop, and she realized every fracture had been scaffolding for this moment. Marcus whispered, "You rose, Jamila. Not alone, but never owed." And she answered with quiet conviction, "Together is the only legacy worth leaving." Their children's laughter spilled from the car, unbothered by history, and the city's lights bent like crowns around them. Jamila Bebe had not only survived the storm, she had authored it, mastered it, and turned its fury into a foundation. Thank you for staying with us through Jamila's journey of heartbreak, resilience, and rebirth. Every story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, strength and love can rewrite destiny. What part of her story spoke to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. And if this one touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that new beginnings are always possible. Until next time, thank you for listening and for being part of this community of voices, hope, and light.